Good evening, everyone. We'll start in a few moments. All right. It's around 7 o'clock, and we're scheduled for an hour tonight for the discussion of our update on Parking Reimagined. I'm Michael Davis. I'm with Land Development Services, and I'll be co-presenting tonight with Austin Gastrell, who will kick off the presentation, and then we'll kind of change hands as we go through the presentation. And then afterwards, we will have questions, take questions from those who are participating tonight, and have a discussion to round out the hour. So with that, I will turn it over to Austin to begin.
Thank you, Mike. As Mike said, my name is Austin Gastrell, and I'm with the Department of Planning and Development. Mike is with Land Development Services and will be co-presenting tonight with me. We're here this evening to provide a status update of the Parking Reimagined project, including a summary of significant proposed administrative changes and new draft bicycle parking requirements. In June, we updated the board on our progress with the project, which coincided with the release of our tiered framework for public comment. Since then, we have released draft minimum parking requirements for all uses in the zoning ordinance, while continuing a public outreach period, which included 6 community open houses, as well as outreach to board advisory committees, community-specific associations and boards, and industry groups. As a reminder, this project deals mainly with minimum parking rates, which dictate the minimum amount of parking required for a development or use. With the exception of the existing planned Tyson's Corner district, this project does not propose caps on parking known as parking maximums. As of November of last year, we released draft ordinance text, which include minimum parking rates, administrative provisions, off-street loading requirements, and minimum bicycle parking requirements for public review and comment. The public comment period is open until January 16th, and a link to our webpage will be put in the chat where you can comment on our proposal. An in-depth review of this proposal can also be found in the white paper posted to the Parking Reimagined webpage. As a quick reminder, our project goals include developing parking regulations that align with the diverse context of land use within Fairfax County, such as the tiered framework. Also, we have sought to create more regulatory flexibility in designing and providing parking, while establishing simplified and predictable parking review processes. When we initiated this project in October of 2021, we identified some core community values that we intend to address, such as equity, affordability, environmental impacts, land use site design, and economic impact. Our current white paper outlines these values and explores examples of how this project addresses them. All of these values and the proposed changes to Article 6 of the zoning ordinance positively support the goals of One Fairfax and the strategic plan. I'll now hand it over to Mike, who will summarize proposed changes to administrative provisions of the ordinance, as well as certain changes to minimum parking requirements. Mike.
Thank you very much, Austin. Subsections 6100.1 through 6100.3 of the zoning ordinance discuss the general applicability of parking requirements, design of parking lots and spaces, and applicable standards to the calculation of required parking. The proposed changes outlined on the screen are intended to provide greater ease and flexibility in determining parking needs for sites and uses, which can be a complicated process, achieving little actual benefit. It should also reduce artificial requirements for more parking. Further, these changes will enhance opportunities for parking adjustments to accommodate electric vehicle chargers and parking lot landscaping, with the goal of creating opportunities for environmental enhancements, particularly for existing parking lots that lack tree cover. Also, as depicted here, we're also considering a concept to enhance requirements for safer pedestrian circulation within parking lots. While ADA requirements will continue to be in effect, we're looking at dedicated pedestrian pathway standards for the ordinance. These connections would be from existing off-site sidewalks to the primary building entrance. This subsection of Article 6 includes the base minimum parking rates for all uses identified in the zoning ordinance. These rates have been available for public review since July of 2022. In addition to the rates, many of which have been right-sized or simplified, this update includes modifications to proposed townhouse and stacked townhouse rates to fine-tune the visitor overflow parking minimums to balance parking and open space, proposed lowering of minimum parking for offices greater than 50,000 square foot. This incorporates additional data and analysis received during the project. Reducing the outdoor restaurant seating minimum requirement from 8 to 5 spaces per 1,000 gross square feet, with the possibility of no minimum requirement for this seating. Eliminating the director determination requirement for parking for all public park areas. Park operators have internal design and parking supply requirements for facilities within these parks. Further changes include updated rates for shopping centers. We've also created more flexibility in the types of uses that can be within a shopping center without requiring more parking. We've also applied the shopping center concept to office uses, allowing a greater number of uses within these buildings without requiring more parking. And this section also includes vehicle stacking requirements, which have been updated following staff analysis. This includes a reduction in required stacking spaces for drive-through uses. This screen shows the tiered framework we've been discussing with the community since June of this year. At least 90% of the county's land area would remain subject to baseline requirements with modifications. Minimum parking requirements below the baseline rates are focused on areas defined in the comprehensive plan as growth areas. With the intent of right-sizing parking, the framework is particularly important where the densities and intensities of development and the availability of non-auto options allow for greater innovation and approaches to lower parking supply. The range of required parking between the baseline and the existing planned Tyson's Corner requirements is between 60 and 90% of the baseline rates. This subsection of the ordinance defines the tiered parking framework. It also defines how residential development is proposed to be treated within tiers. Single-family attached, stacked townhomes, and multifamily developments have proposed rates that are not specifically aligned with the percentage reductions in the tiers. Single-family attached and stacked townhomes have lower minimum rates that continue to recognize that a separate vehicle overflow parking supply is needed, even when the unit parking rate is adjusted downward within the tiered framework. In lowering requirements for these unit types, we want to acknowledge that in higher density and intensity development areas of the county, less parking demand is expected, with opportunities for multimodal transport and a variety of amenities in closer proximity to the community. We're also proposing a modification to the multifamily minimum requirements in the tiered framework. Historically, parking requirements for these residential developments are based on spaces per number of units. However, we recognize that the number of bedrooms within these types of developments provide a more accurate assessment of parking demand. Thus, we're proposing to use a bedroom measure within higher density areas. And here's a reminder of the applicability of the tiered framework to an identified use, showing a lower baseline rate in percentage increments through the tiered framework. This subsection contains options to adjust or reduce the parking supply for a development site. Today, parking adjustments are divided in the ordinance between those which can be approved by the Board of Supervisors and those which can be approved by the Director of Land Development Services. It's proposed that adjustments up to 60% less than the required parking can be approved by the Director after review by technical staff. Currently, this is capped at 30% for some adjustments. It is anticipated that the board can approve reductions associated with land use actions after technical input is provided by staff. The board can approve adjustments that the director is unable to approve. The proposed changes to allowable adjustments include new options for shared parking reductions and transit-related adjustments, an affordable housing adjustment, An adjustment based on the proximity of public parking, such as metered parking or garages allowing public parking, and a consideration of adjustment opportunities for sites that have a historic designation and or tree coverage worthy of preservation that may conflict with minimum parking requirements. And with that, I will turn it back over to Austin to continue our presentation.
Thank you, Mike. Subsection 6101 defines minimum vehicle loading requirements. These requirements are proposed to be condensed and right-sized to address current loading practices and in response to analysis of frequently waived provisions. Establishing minimum bicycle parking requirements in the ordinance was envisioned from the onset of this project. Providing these requirements is important to support bicycle usage, which offsets auto parking demand. Staff has worked with Fairfax County Department of Transportation and the County Attorney's Office to propose bicycle parking requirements as a new section of the zoning ordinance. The bicycle parking section includes minimum required bicycle parking rates, general provisions to define when bicycle parking is required, as well as location and design requirements for bicycle parking spaces. Bicycle parking minimum requirements would be treated similar to vehicle parking by establishing a table of minimum requirements organized by land use classification. Bicycle parking rates for land uses and use classifications are proposed to be based on either a percentage of provided vehicle parking or a set number of spaces. These requirements would align with our proposed tiered framework by setting increased bicycle parking requirements in areas with denser development or in areas that are in closer proximity to public transit. This slide shows examples of that, showing where in a multifamily dwelling, for example, you could have a percentage of 5, 10, or 15% of provided vehicle parking, which would be your bicycle parking rate, or uses like industrial uses where we've had a specific number of spaces. So 2 spaces if you're in a base rate, 4 spaces if you're located within a revitalization area, or 8 spaces per use when located in a transit station area, TOD, Transit Oriented Development, or the Tyson's Urban Center. Next, get this started here. This is a project we've been working on to have an interactive map for the Parking Reimagined project. Here I use a district avenue or mosaic address to show how you can look up properties by address. This will give you an idea of what the parking rate is for that property. In this case, it was a revitalization area parking rate. However, you can also scroll around the map and click around. It's interactive, showing you the different types of parking rates in a certain area. So this is a really important tool for not only citizens, but also staff for knowing what is the parking rate for this area. It's something that a developer could use when proposing to go into an area to determine, hey, what is my parking rate going to be? Or it can also, like I said, be for county employees working to determine, hey, I'm working on this case, what's the parking rate here? So it's an interactive map, and this is something that we're going to be have put on our webpage here shortly in a draft format, so people can kind of see what the impact of an area could be, as in what the parking rates in your neighborhood could be or your community could be, and it's something that we're happy to be able to provide. Since the kickoff in this project in October of 2021, we've conducted nearly 80 project meetings, which include supervisor-sponsored town halls, individual project meetings with all board members, as well as meetings with board advisory committees, community service groups, community associations, industry groups, and internal county agencies. Since January of 2022, we've met monthly with our community project work group to discuss elements of our proposal and gain their perspectives. These discussions have been important in modifying our proposal and framing our public discussions of them. After our current public outreach period, staff will make modifications as needed to create a final draft ordinance with the intent to repeal and replace the provisions currently located in Article 6 of the zoning ordinance. As I mentioned earlier, and Bill dropped it in the chat, we have a link to our webpage where the proposed ordinance is currently located. You can click on that public information or public input tab there to give us your input on the proposed rates. The updated project timeline before you shows our goal of bringing a complete proposal back to the Planning Commission and Board in early 2023 to early summer of 2023. Lastly, as mentioned, we have a project webpage that is regularly updated with information and opportunities for the public to participate in the Parking Reimagined project. I want to thank you for your time tonight, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Donna, I see you have your hand up.
Go ahead, Donna. You're on mute right now, but if you'd like to ask a question, feel free.
Okay. Thank you. I'm confused about one thing. I thought I heard you say that parking reductions up to 60% or less can be reviewed by the Director of Land Development Services. Is that correct?
In the current proposal that we released in November, it allows the director to approve a parking reduction of up to 60%.
Okay. And even though the Director of Land Development Services is not a elected office, it's not like a supervisor.
That is correct. And today, the director does have an ability to approve parking reductions. The proposal that we have changes that percentage that the director is allowed to approve. It also expands some of the abilities to approve a parking reduction. But in all cases, staff provides a technical analysis of the parking reduction and provides a recommendation to the board, even if the board is the entity that's considering the reduction. So it's still a technical process for parking adjustments and undergoes a rigorous staff review as part of that.
What is the current percentage that the director can review at this stage?
The current percentage is 30%, and it applies to shared parking reductions primarily. I'm not sure if any other reduction applies currently, but primarily shared parking, the director has a limit of 30%.
Thank you.
And I don't know who this is, but the person that says iPad has their hand up, and they were the next person with their hand up. If you want to ask your question.
iPad is, for some reason, I'm Adrienne White, what my iPad defaults to. So I guess that's my name on Zoom calls. I'd like to see the assumptions that your consultant, Fairfax County staff, and the members of the task force for Parking Reimagined agreed upon in coming up with these proposed numbers of spaces for each type of use. For example, I'm really skeptical about 1.3 spaces per attached single-family townhouse. My first house that I bought in Oakton had 2 spaces assigned to each house and a couple of guest spaces. And at that time, in the 1970s, that wasn't enough parking. Not much has changed in that area since, and I'd like to see the assumptions upon which 1.3 were based.
1.3, can you, I'm not sure where you're looking or what rate you're looking at for.
It's 1.3, Mike, not 1.3. It says 1.3 spaces per unit. And for townhouses, that's when you're in a transit station area. The townhouse rate outside of the tiered framework remains the same at 2.7 spaces per unit. However, some of those spaces must be dedicated for visitors shared, which is actually potentially requires more spaces than it would be today. So for townhome parking, there's no change, there's no reduction in the amount. There's the 2.7 when you're talking countywide. It only potentially changes when you go into some of the tiered areas, such as a revitalization area, such as a transit station area. So the 1.3 spaces per unit for single family attached, as you mentioned, is a transit station area parking number.
And
So
I'd also like to really quickly mention that 1.3 is just part of the rate. It's also an extra 0.3 spaces per unit for visitor or shared parking. And this has been in response to community concern of lack of available visitor or shared parking and townhouse developments that we're proposing that a percentage, or at this point, 0.3 for a transit station area, it is provided for visitor or shared parking per unit. Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry. So I'm the president of the Allison Heights Mount Daniel Civic Association, which is right across the street from the West Falls Church WMATA station, right across Haycock Road. And EYA is proposing to build townhouses on the WMATA site. And if only 1.3 spaces are required for a townhouse, I'd like to see data that shows why that's appropriate and the assumptions that were made, because we don't want those people parking on our streets.
So just really quickly, I'm Aaron Wilkowitz. I live about a half mile from that proposed development, and just want to say that that development is quite literally feet away from a metro station. My experience in Arlington is that the number of spots you need in townhouses that are that close to a metro is a fraction of what you would need in a typical townhouse situation. I lived in townhouses right by the metro in Arlington and did not have a car. Most of my neighbors did not have a car. So I think I'm actually really excited that you guys are introducing a tiered system, because I think it just addresses common sense cases just like that, right? Where you're right next to a metro station, you don't need as many parking spaces as you would need like in the middle of a car dense area.
I appreciate your experience, Aaron, but I think Fairfax County and Arlington counties are very different. And I'd like to see the assumptions and the data that were used to come up with that number by Fairfax County.
Well, on our webpage, we do have data regarding a peer review that was done by our consultant of peer jurisdictions. The rates that came up with are based on our review of other jurisdictions, as well as staff review of our current rates and all the meetings that we had with different community groups, industry groups, as well as, like I mentioned, peer jurisdictions who have gone through recent processes to update their rates. I would just really want to just drive in this one point that when it comes to townhouses, we are raising the rate pretty much at this point. It's something that in the base rate is what I'm talking about here. We are raising the proposed rate based on concerns from constituents, concerns from elected officials regarding lack of available visitor, shared, and just general parking in townhouse communities. For that reason, we added a visitor and shared percentage for each unit in these different tiers.
But there is in the study, nowhere I can find on the Parking Reimagined website, a list of assumptions.
Okay, well, thank you. I think Austin's comments are relevant to that, that as far as how we began to work to develop this information and use it as part of our proposal. So if you take a look at that and if there's more information that you need, you can contact us separately and we can see if there's more information that we can provide. But
thank you. I will do that. I've read every word of it.
Okay, thank you. The next person who has their hand up is Fran.
Did that work?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. You talked about the parking reduction that can be approved by the director. Is there any community input into that, or is that just done and then all of a sudden we find out about it? How does that piece of it work?
Those that are considered for approval by the director are not part of the community discussion. But even with that, under our current procedure, we do notify the supervisor, the district supervisor, that we are, that a reduction has been submitted and under consideration, and that provides an opportunity for feedback from the district supervisor. But I'll note also that those that go to the board for consideration are also not public hearings. They are administrative actions that the board considers for approval. So it's not a typical, it's the parking adjustment considerations are not similar to a public hearing for a rezoning case, unless, of course, the parking adjustment is
Part of the rezoning.
part of the rezoning. So they're probably about 50% of the parking reductions that we consider are part of a rezoning application. So there is that opportunity associated with those
Well,
proposals.
My concern is that this adjustment could impact the surrounding neighborhood, and it's going to be done behind their back, sort of. All of a sudden they'll find out it happened and they won't have an opportunity to comment. So that's very troublesome to me. Another question I have is, you talked about parking based on bedrooms, and how do you define bedrooms? If I have a sleep sofa in my living room, is that a bedroom?
No, a bedroom, if you're looking at it and it applies to multifamily development.
Right.
So in that regard, if a multifamily unit has 1 bedroom, 2 bedrooms, or 3 bedrooms, or more than 3 bedrooms, that's how that is measured. So
Does a bedroom mean 2 cars, or a bedroom mean 1 car?
the bedroom,
Parking space, I'm sorry.
it would increase as you go along. So let's say you have the rate that applies to a 1-bedroom apartment would be that rate times essentially the number of units, because if all of the units are 1 bedroom, then it would just be that multiplier.
Yeah, but
But
how
if
many
you have-
spaces? How many spaces per bedroom? 1?
Well, the baseline rates, the bedroom rate applies to only certain areas of the county. So as we've proposed, it applies to revitalization areas, transit station areas, and transit-oriented development areas, as well as the planned Tyson's Corner area.
So
So within those areas, those factors would come into play. And if you have, most of the multifamily we see is a mix of 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units. And so you would apply that ratio to the number of bedrooms. So as you have a higher number of multi-bedroom units, the parking rate goes higher.
And
Yeah,
for
but I'm
example, the revitalization area district or tier, so that would be your CRDs, let's just say the Richmond Highway area. The proposed multifamily dwelling rate is 0.6 spaces per bedroom.
0.6 per
Mhm.
bedroom.
And that's in the revitalization area, which is one of the tiered areas.
Okay, so if you have a 2-bedroom apartment, you can maybe have 4 people using the bedroom, 2 in each bedroom. You could have somebody sleeping on a sleep sofa, and you're going to give them 1.5 spaces, is basically what you're saying. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, we're looking at it based on bedroom, and that's how the data from the Institute of Transportation Engineers, national data, that's kind of the baseline that they use to calculate those rates. So from that perspective, they're not discriminating, how many people are in the, in a specific unit, in a specific location. It's just a situation where it recognizes that if you have a 3-bedroom apartment, there's more vehicle ownership. There tends to be more vehicle ownership than a 1-bedroom apartment. So that it accounts for that ratio.
But not necessarily enough to park another car. I think we're just a little off here, because when you look at the cost of apartments, whether it be rental or purchase, they're kind of high, and people will do things like shared apartments and so on. So I think that reduction is going to come back and bite us a little bit. And then one last question, and that's accessibility and ADA requirements. How does that fit into this picture?
So what we're proposing does not impact the accessibility requirements per se. When you have accessibility requirements are per ADA, and let's say that a site is located within a revitalization area, which is parked at 80% of the base rate. the ADA spaces are still based on the base requirement. So in that case,
They could go down.
They would
also.
not. They would not go down.
They would not go down.
It would not go down. It is based on the base requirement. And it's not based on a tiered adjustment, 80, 70%, something like that. It is based on the base overall parking requirement for a use.
And does that say, is that said somewhere in this package?
It is.
I didn't really see it addressed, so that's
It is.
why.
It's in my
I'm-
section is 7.
Section 7, okay, I'll take a look.
No,
Thank you.
no, I was asking Mike what section
Oh.
exactly it was in.
I believe it's in section 3, 6100.3. But it could be in 1 or 2, but I think it's in 3. It's either in 1, 2, or 3.
But it's somewhere in there, you're telling me.
It
Yes.
definitely is in there.
It's in 6100.3 F.
Say that again, please.
6103 F.
3 as in
Accessible
Frank.
spaces are included in the calculation of required number of parking spaces. The number of accessible spaces provided is based on the minimum number of spaces required for the use or building prior to any adjustments permitted under subsection 6100.5 or 6100.6.
Now, is that number, can that number be reduced by either the Board of Supervisors or the director?
It does not include that provision.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay, I think the next person that has a question is Susan Jolie.
Yes, thank you. Preliminary observation, I'm president of a civic association with some 240 homes adjacent to the Annandale Revitalization District. And I received no notice of this until recently and no outreach from the planning staff. And it seems to me, just looking at your timeline of who you've consulted with, there are an awful lot of politicians and an awful lot of government agencies, but I question the numbers of actual individuals who would be impacted that might be actually involved in this process. Having said that, I'd have a preliminary question and some backup, more specific questions. Has anyone involved in this survey actually set foot in Annandale? And specifically, have you looked at the existing infrastructure? What utilization is occurring in the existing parking lots, which are overcrowded, used day and night? There are a lot of people who come into Annandale to seek specialized services and restaurants, and they drive. Have you assessed the infrastructure to support the assumptions about walkability? We have windy, not very well lit streets. They're spread out, they wind, they curve, they're narrow. We lack curbs in many areas, and even more neighborhoods with curbs have no sidewalks. Thirdly, have you done any study that would tell you about population density currently and distance to the supposed transit options in the community? It just seems to me that Annandale is so far from the kinds of developments you describe in your document that it really does not fit. So I'm really wondering what in-depth research you did into specific communities.
So I'll start to address your question with number of public outreach. That's something that I specifically drove in this project and have continued to drive. Since the beginning of this project, we've worked with our Office of Public Affairs to attempt in any way possible to get a hold of groups, let it be through newsletters, Board of Supervisor newsletters, Facebook posts, Nextdoor posts. At this point, we've had 10 to 12 open houses that have just been general specific open houses throughout this project, starting in November of 2021 is when it started. And further, we have worked with different community groups trying to spread this word. It's unfortunate you feel that way. However, county staff has gone to every end possible to try to get this word out in front of people, to get more people involved in this project, because we really do care about what the community thinks. And we want to attempt to work with the community to come up with provisions which address the needs of the county. But I'll let Mike further address your comments specifically regarding Annandale.
Yes, and I am very familiar with Annandale. I don't live very far from there, and I've been in Annandale many times. But one of the other things that I will note with regard to Annandale is we are proposing a baseline requirement that is 20% less than our overall baseline, which is consistent with what is available in Annandale today as a parking reduction. The Annandale is designated as a community revitalization district, and property owners and tenants who are in that area can request today to get a 20% reduction in their parking requirement. So we tried to tailor our recommendation in the revitalization areas to what exists today, or what options are available today for parking. And so that was our goal for Annandale and the other community revitalization districts. The other thing I'll note about Annandale is I hear what you're saying about the infrastructure and property access and being able to access properties from the adjoining roadways. But I'll also say that Annandale is a relatively compact area with regard to development. The retail development in the core is pretty close together in a lot of cases. And there is sidewalk infrastructure available there for people to circulate around by foot or by bicycle. And certainly from a planning perspective, the intent is to capitalize on that to design a community, a business district community that will become even more walkable, bikeable, and accessible. And so, as we've noted in our presentation, our approach is to plan parking in conjunction with planning efforts and planned areas within the county. And so from this perspective, I think what we're proposing perfectly aligns with what is intended for Annandale in the long-term plan.
If I can follow up, you talk about the existing regulation, but and correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't we talking here about a change from the ability to request, in which case the community has some input into the final decision? And what this Parking Reimagined zoning change would allow a developer to decrease the parking minimum requirement by right. So in that sense, are you not taking away from communities the ability to comment on the whether or not any particular proposal meets the community needs? And in fact, those needs that you outlined as your objectives in this study, seems to me you take away, by granting developers by right the ability to do something, you take away a community's ability to influence the outcome. Am I incorrect about that?
Well, currently in Annandale, a commercial property owner can ask the county for a 20% reduction in their parking requirement. And that goes to the Board of Supervisors for consideration. And it would be similar to the parking reduction process that we administer in land development services, where it would be an administrative item that goes to the board for their consideration. It's not a public hearing item. So from that perspective, it's not, clearly the supervisor will know about a proposal under that regime and, have that opportunity to provide the input. But the community is not directly involved in those types of proposals for reduction.
And I also ask Austin a question. You've outlined the town hall meetings that were held. Do you keep a list of the number or identity of participants in all of those town hall meetings?
Not the number or identity per se specifically. We don't ask for people to sign up for these. However, each one of our town hall meetings, as well as other meetings that we've had with different community groups and civic groups, recordings of those are on our webpage. And so I would say that if you're interested in those, you can go back and look at those, but we don't specifically require people to sign up for these. So we don't keep a record of who attended, but we do keep a video recording of the meeting itself, which is on the webpage.
Okay, I think the next person who has their hand raised is Cheryl Sim.
And after Cheryl, real quick, we're going to go to Cynthia after Cheryl. She'd sent me a message and said she couldn't raise her hand. So Cheryl, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I'm following on what Susan Jolie just said and what Austin just said. And that relates to the record keeping that you all have about the previous meetings that you held and what groups have more import into your decision making. And I think, as Michael Davis knows, I've had an exchange with Chairman Jeff McKay about this. And I really find it somewhat peculiar that you have a working group, but you have no recorded messages, recordings of those meetings or minutes of those meetings that seem to me to be not really in the best practices of transparency. I also have questions about what the developers are required to do in exchange for your very generous reductions in their minimum parking requirements. It seems to me that there's a lot of smoke out there about there's more green space or there's amenities, but they're not required to do anything. So tell me, how does the community really benefit when this seems, again, to be a kind of a developer-driven exercise that will eliminate them having to spend $40,000 to $60,000 on parking spaces? And what does the community get in return? So thank you.
Well, I can start on the on responding to the question about the community benefit. And one of the key drivers, as you mentioned in your comments, is the cost of providing parking. And one of the goals of Fairfax County is to try to reduce the amount or try to reduce the cost of housing, trying to find more affordable housing opportunities for our citizens. And so from that perspective, particularly for multifamily development, as one example, it costs a great deal of money to provide parking that
yeah, I'm going to
dampens-
interrupt you on this point. I'm really sorry for doing this. EYA is building townhomes across Fairfax County. EYA has been a member of your work group. If EYA is going to spend $40,000 to $60,000 or save $40,000 to $60,000 on reduced parking, are you sitting there with a straight face and telling us that they are going to reduce the cost of an $800,000 to a $1 million townhome by $40,000 to $60,000 to make it affordable? I mean, I really don't see how you can make that connection. And I think, a number of us have been following these issues now for a number of years, and it doesn't seem to us that we're getting much of anything from these how shall I phrase it, benefits to developers.
Well, let me finish my statement. I was referring to multifamily development. I wasn't referring to townhouse development as part of that conversation. But, again, there's a pretty significant cost for parking relative to providing housing units. And if there are ways to provide additional flexibility to reduce that parking that makes sense, then I think it's worth pursuing to be able to provide more affordable housing within the county. So I think that is one community benefit that we can see from looking at parking. The other community benefit is more of an environmental benefit in the sense that if you provide an opportunity to have flexibility in parking, it allows for the design of more compact development communities. We have flexibility in Tyson's for parking. And as part of that planned effort in Tyson's, we are getting higher density downtown type development in that area. And so from that point of view, people who live there or work there have an opportunity to access restaurants, shopping, and those sorts of things without having to drive to that. They can walk to it, they can ride a bike, they have transit available to them. And so that's why our project really focuses the lower parking requirements on these higher density areas where those other opportunities exist to reduce parking and provide this environmental benefit. Because if you're taking cars off the road, you're reducing the amount of pollution that's occurring in this area. And this area is in a non-attainment zone for vehicle pollution. So, little things mean a lot. And I think what we're trying to do with parking flexibility is to create those opportunities to be able to see these benefits as we move along into the future of the county.
All right, Cynthia, you're next.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. I do appreciate all your efforts, especially with the increase in bicycle parking and pedestrian access. But I'm stuck on, and this is also something that Susan just touched on, the affordability access. And Austin, as you just said, more affordable housing is one of the goals of this Parking Reimagined. But I'm having a difficulty with that because of the track record so far. And I'll give you a very good example in 2020, where Stanley Martin Company in RZ/FDP 2019-SU-005, in their proposal, they were required to provide affordable dwelling units. And this property now is the Newbrook property over in the Westfields. And if you look on your own county website, affordable dwelling units should be at the AMI rate for $82,300. That would mean around $300,000 is what would be considered an affordable dwelling unit in this area. However, what happened was these units got built, and the least expensive unit was $650,000. I can actually give you a specific address if you'd like. But so what I'm trying to understand is where we just say affordable housing and that never pans out. So what's the process, or where will there be in the process to ensure that when something gets written up to say that, yes, this will be allowed to have affordable dwelling units and affordable housing and living areas, yet that promise is broken by not doing that, by building $700,000, $800,000 homes? Where is our assurance that someone somewhere will be saying, no, you can't build $800,000 homes. You have to build $300,000 to $400,000 homes, condos, townhomes, whatever, but you have to provide more affordable dwelling units. Who's going to be monitoring that? And because it's not happening now.
So affordable dwelling is ADUs, or workforce
Yes.
dwelling is WDUs. Those are, the ADUs are profit or in the zoning ordinance, and also profit, as well as the WDUs. Those don't directly relate to the parking. What the general comment was that, if you require 1.3 spaces per parking space for multifamily, you potentially decrease the cost to build that development, which could potentially relate to reduction in the price of that.
And that's my point. That's my point.
But your comments about ADUs and WDUs,
That was an example.
Well, I mean, that has nothing to do about what we're dealing with the parking ordinance. So if there's an issue of the proffer in an ADU, housing community development, they have to provide that information to them. They enforce the ADU requirements, they enforce the WDU requirements. I couldn't tell you exactly, I don't know specifics about your case, but that agency does provide the enforcement of ADUs and WDUs to make sure that they meet it, and the development has to be, certify that yearly that they're meeting the WDU requirements in terms of what they're renting it at, or if it's a sale, it goes to the county and they and verify the sales of those units. So,
well, I just find it a little disingenuous in the white paper to say that this will provide more affordable housing.
But there's nothing in the zoning ordinance that's going to require a developer or anyone, quite frankly, to sell a house at $300,000. There's nothing in the zoning ordinance that's going to require you to resell your house at that amount. That's not the ability to do it. If it's a proffered ADU, there are some restrictions on ability to resell that, as well as WDUs. But beyond that, I mean, it is market rate. So it does provide, when you provide more options for units, that includes parking, options for units that have one space, options for units that have 3 spaces, they're not going to be marketed the same in terms of cost. Provides people the opportunity to choose where they want to live and how they want to provide, units. So they're going to buy a multifamily unit or a townhouse with one car space or 3. There's going to be a price difference in when they make that choice.
Well, I understand what you're trying to say, but what I'm trying to say is that if you're telling me in your white paper that you're doing this, part of your goal of doing this is affordability and equity, then how is it that, we aren't able to then ensure that the developers then need to provide, if we're saving them, and again, back to what Susan was saying, saving them $40,000 and they don't pass it on to the buyer, then you really can't put in your white paper that part of this Parking Reimagined is to help provide more affordable housing, because there's no standard and no way of ensuring that that will be true.
As Bill mentioned, and we'll move on to the next comment, affordable housing and affordable housing units, ADUs and WDUs, are monitored and are enforced through the Housing and Community Development, correct, Bill, group, and they have their own enforcement group to look into issues related to that.
I just request respectfully maybe to remove that whole affordability as part of your white paper, as part of your bullet items for your goals, because that can't be a goal that you could ever meet. Thank you.
All right, next, I believe we have Aaron, and then Tammy, and then Clyde.
Hey there. I'll just start with an extremely brief comment in response to the concept of how parking minimums can affect affordability. Just very briefly, if you have a requirement for fewer parking spaces, a direct result of that is you can build more buildings, you can build more houses, you can build more things for people to live in. And that's what reduces the price, right? Like you can see time and time again that the places that reduce their parking minimums eventually build more units, and on the whole net, the prices go down. So I think that's where these guys are coming in with the idea of affordability, even if they're not explicitly talking about ADUs or WDUs or anything else like that. I just wanted to say that Michael, Austin, and anybody else here from the county, you guys did a really good job of making a lot of smart changes. I went through everything, and you made things a lot more efficient. Did a lot of things that were generally sensible. You made some modest reductions in the parking minimums. I thought it all made a lot of sense. I do want to encourage you to push a little harder. I know one of the goals you had was to right size, and I'm curious, where some of that right sizing comes in particular for retail spaces, for office spaces, even for some multifamily dwelling units. I often find that I don't have trouble parking, right? Like even middle of a Saturday, in the middle of a strip mall, I have no trouble parking in Fairfax County. And I wish I had a little more trouble, right? Because in the middle of the week, these parking lots sit completely empty. On Saturdays, they're 70% full. So I was just hoping you could speak a little bit more to, what right sizing means, and whether right sizing means we right size for the people that are here now and the car culture that's here now, or can we start to right size towards a less car dependent culture that we want to move towards? If you could speak to that a little.
Yeah, and I'll start and then have Mike further respond. But I think the right sizing effort was looking at antiquated rates that were either developed in 1978 or 1988 when this ordinance was last touched. It was in a way to try to take a comprehensive look at this portion of the ordinance to determine how can we bring this into the 21st century. And I'll explain that in this way, that we looked at things like, let's just use retail sales for an example. We adjusted that rate based on our research and the data we had gained. And further than just the base rate adjustment, I think the more important part of this project to look at right sizing or modernizing the ordinance is the tiered framework. It's right. Looking at that Fairfax County is an extremely geographically diverse county. One size does not fit all. And so by doing that, we've modernized an ordinance that allows us to have more flexibility in parking areas based on their locational needs and their locational characteristics instead of a carte blanche, one size fits all. I know Mike wanted to further respond as well.
Well, actually, you touched on what I was going to say, in the sense that, 90% of the county, it remains a fairly suburban area. There are still pockets of higher density, but for the most part, we're looking at it as being suburban. And from that point of view, we did look very closely at, what the parking requirements were or are for development in those suburban areas. And then we developed that baseline. But I think, to your point, where we really wanted to look at more innovation and lower parking relative to the other development factors that exist in these higher density areas, that's where we really put forth a greater effort to push down those minimum rates, because it's more appropriate for those areas.
That makes sense. And if you can maybe just speak briefly, like what would the process look like in the future to expand like the total area of some of those reduced zones, right? Because hopefully we'll see increased density in the future. So what happens if that changes?
Sure. I think that's kind of part of it's kind of the beauty of kind of the way we're doing this, is that when you have something that's based on comprehensive plan designation, so you have an area that's determined to be a TSA. So say we expand an area that's a suburban center or a revitalization area into a TSA, it would then retroactively change that, because instead of having to go through a zoning ordinance amendment to add those areas in, we're saying that we're basing this off comprehensive plan land units. And when the comprehensive plan changes, this then would retroactively change. Now, further, something else that we'd be doing, just like any of our recent amendments, we will have a directive from the board to come back and look at this in 18 months to say, hey, what does this look like? What did we mess up on? What did we do great on? What did we not? And it's just an ability for us to kind of have that gut check to look at what is working, what is not working. And then further, like many things, we would, if there's a need to further amend the ordinance, it was something that would be addressed through a zoning ordinance work program item and could be further amended in the future. Mike?
That covers it. As Austin indicated, we've designed this because we looked at planning districts. It makes it easier to make those adjustments in the future as the nature of the planning districts change, or if there are new planning districts added that conform to this framework.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Again, really appreciate the great work you're doing. It's awesome. Thanks.
Thank you, Aaron. Tammy, you're up next.
Thank you. In a word, thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation. We've gotten the gist of this. I sit on the Reston Planning and Zoning Committee, and I hear this all the time, routinely in applications. Developers are asking for reductions. There's a reason for that. Money, strictly money. Ask them to give space for trees, can't do it. They might stick to the setback, or they might ask for a variance, and if they do, they usually get it. So I am really hot on this. One thing y'all have not addressed is, and somebody said it, I don't know whether it was, I think it was Aaron. You have this parking reduction. Austin, you just said in 18 months, where did we screw up? We don't know. Big, giant neon sign, COVID. We have no clue what our structure or society is going to end up with. What we do know is there's not one aspect of our society that has escaped COVID unchanged. And we don't know where we're jumping off and where we're going to end up, hopefully, if we end up, or if there's pandemics are just a way of life. And I will tell you, there are so many flaws in Parking Reimagined, I hardly know where to start. So you reduce the parking and you build buildings. Well, you're not putting trees in or something that can help global warming, which is costing the county and its insurers and its residents and its business people hundreds of millions of dollars in damage, and more to come because it's not getting better, it's exacerbating. So you have no trees that's going to ameliorate climate change. You're putting buildings in there. What if you screw it up? You've given away the possibility of clawing back parking, right? Yes, that is correct. Was in a meeting on a project in a TSA. A TSA is supposed to have less parking, right? Yes, the answer is yes. We're gonna bike, walk, and take the metro. And thank God around TSAs, there's a relative bus system. However, Fairfax County does not have TSAs in urban areas like the district with a grid pattern with a viable bus service that people can actually get from A to B to C to D within their lifetime. So the executive in this meeting of a major developer told our group that everybody who lives in a TSA would also need to own a car. I credit him for being absolutely frank and honest. The reason for that is in specific TSAs, there are not grocery stores available. There are not grocery stores. You would have to get on the metro, go somewhere, go to a grocery store, all your bags, go back, and it's not going to happen. People that we do not live in Amsterdam. We don't live on a flat area. We're very hilly. We don't live in a climate that's predictable. We have hellacious hot and freezing cold. You all know that. We have storms. What are people going to do during these weather extremes, which are more and more common and last longer? They cannot walk and bike. This is a fallacy. I have no problem with you putting in bike racks for people who choose to do that, but that is not going to predominate our traffic, our transportation modes. It is simply not going to do it. We are living in an area where people go far distances for various reasons. So people have to have cars to transport kids, elderly, sick people, etc. This idea is this Disney thing that everybody can walk and bike is ludicrous. What you're really doing, and I'd like you to admit it, is you're giving a cash giveaway to developers, and you're talking about more density. That's not sustainable ecologically. And I'm flawed. There's so many things. We talked about Bill Malin, I love you. You were talking about ADUs and WDUs, and there are parking requirements in those specific, and that's a very, very small portion of our affordable housing, very tiny. In fact, it was reduced from 12 units per 100 to 8. So we've reduced. We're supposed to bow down
that's just factually untrue. The 12 to 8 actually increased it, and I know you don't believe it, but it really did, because when it was 12, that was 80% and 100% and 120%, and those are not affordable.
I don't want to waste my time arguing about that, because there was 120 AMIs and they couldn't sell them. They couldn't rent them. It's over market. So there was a fallacy in how that was ever.
Right.
That was
they weren't affordable, so we shouldn't talk about it being affordable one way or the other.
We're not going to talk about that. That's a waste of time. But what I will say is where they do exist, the occupants of those units aren't guaranteed parking in the garages. If it's multifamily, those parking costs are uncoupled from the rent or the purchase price. So people who get in those units and are lucky to get in them with the lower AMIs, they can't afford parking. So what you have done is you wiped away any opportunity to put in trees. If you really thought we didn't need more parking, You could leave that area where you're not doing the parking as parks with trees and see if we need it in the future. You don't do that. You build it up, and then what do? How do we fix this? You can't fix it. Putting more decisions into administrative by right is insane. We citizens have been inundated in the last couple of years with the county supervisors putting more and more and more decisions by right, so they don't have to have public hearings. Well, public hearings are ridiculous anyway. We come, we talk, we plead, we tell the truth, and we're told, thanks, next. And then the supervisors go and they do what they had decided to do before they ever had a public hearing. The planning commission is much different. They actually will ask questions, but the board of supervisors who makes the decisions is off the chart. I would like you, the people who did Parking Reimagined, to present publicly a paper that shows all of the changes that you are making, so that we have an opportunity to analyze exactly who's benefiting. And I think we all know, and you've heard from the people who have commented, most of them, is that we don't think it's the public. We think there's lots of problems with this. We would wish that you would go back and figure out how exactly this is equitable, because it's not, and how it helps the environment. These are two priorities stated by the Board of Supervisors, and Parking Reimagined doesn't help either one of them. So I will close with asking you for that. We just absolutely need to have the data. When did you do these studies? Pre-COVID? Because that's out the window. Our patterns have completely changed, and wishing and planning are not going to change that. Also, do you have the inspectors to go around and look and see what's going on? We heard that people check the ADUs and WDUs. That's fairly easy because there aren't very many of them. But no parking given for parks, because the parking authority will handle it. The parking authority is broke. We all know that. They're upping their fees on everything. We're putting the dots together and we're getting screwed, and we don't like it. So please stop this charade that this is for the public good. It is not. Thank you.
I'll just respond briefly to the comment about COVID. We did purposefully look at information that we had before COVID, because as Tammy indicated, COVID changed a lot of behaviors, and this question still remains as to whether or not those behavior changes are going to be permanent or if they will modify in some way. So we really did try to look at the situation with parking for uses prior to COVID. But I guess partly to Tammy's point, there was just information released yesterday from WMATA that indicates that they are assessing how they're going to operate transit in this current circumstance, because it's unclear. The
They're
federal
at 37% of what they were pre-COVID. So
Correct.
this idea that everybody's going to transit, bike, or walk, that's not working unless
Well,
you're very insular and you're going grandma down to the store that's below you. No, that doesn't exist. That's
well,
in
the
an
other
urban
side of the
city.
coin is, if there's no parking, if things have changed and people are not driving to work as much as they used to, they're teleworking, then that's going to lower parking demand even more, frankly. So,
Well,
we didn't
Therein
take that
lies
into
the rub,
consideration.
Michael, because some employers love the lower overhead of the smaller offices. Others want their people in there. So that's what I'm saying about COVID. We don't know where this is going to wash out. So why on earth, with a county as supposedly sophisticated as Fairfax, start doing a major overhaul that could be potentially damage commerce and the quality of life for their people? Why would you do that right now? I am not averse to looking at the parking regulation, but you know what? I live in Reston. There ain't no parking except the paved for garages in town center. People don't go there anymore because you have to pay to park. So that you know, retail after retail after restaurant has gone out of business there. It's outrageous. They're very successful marketing their commercial spaces, but the retail and the things that people go to for services, you don't want to be in RTC anymore. So, you know, the county's different all over and has different needs. And I'm really concerned that you're ganging up and you're doing things to serve already wealthy developers at the expense of the poor. And those are the people that are going to suffer. They are doubling up in apartments. Their landlords are charging them now for parking where it used to be free. There aren't enough spaces, even if they pay, and now they're street parking. And even wealthy buildings screwed up and didn't put enough parking in. And you know, there's a case of 47 cars out of one luxury building in Reston that parks curb parking, and they take up the spaces of the working poor. It's crazy. It
Well,
just
thank
isn't.
you. I just wanted to clarify when we started the study and what we took into consideration. So thank you.
Thank you.
For your comments.
Okay, Clyde.
Oh, go ahead.
I was say Clyde has his hand up and is next, and I believe Clyde will be the last question that we have for the night since we're over our time.
Good evening. I suppose there should be no argument with right sizing parking. That makes all the sense. What comes across is we are reducing parking. I couldn't tell from your 10-minute summary of what you're proposing as to whether in every case we're reducing parking or we are increasing parking. Perhaps in some instances, I'm not sure. But what comes across strongly is right sizing is to be implemented principally by reducing minimum parking requirements. And perhaps that's exactly right. The county, you all folks have a lot of hypothetical benefits that you ascribe to this reducing parking requirements. I don't know if it was Austin or Mike who said by reducing parking requirements, we'll take cars off the road, and that will be a benefit for the county. I don't know that reducing parking requirements is going to take any cars off the road. I think people will have cars. They just maybe won't be able to park them on site where they live. But I don't think that's going to be a big benefit for the county, that suddenly we have a lot fewer cars on the road because we've reduced parking requirements. So what's entirely missing in my mind is concerns about, suppose we don't have enough parking. What will happen then? How will we manage that? Because as a resident, and I live nearby Seven Corners, but not very nearby Seven Corners, but I think the people that live nearby Seven Corners should be concerned if over time the parking, on-site parking there is insufficient for the developments that occur, that the people that own cars and live in those developments will simply park on the public streets in the residential communities surrounding Seven Corners. And that would be a disbenefit certainly to that community. So my first question is, we have standards today. How well do they work? Are there in Reston, is there too little parking or too much parking? And in Tyson's Corner, what about that Mason District? They have some residential mixed use there. Is there too little parking, too much parking? Do we have a sense of how well the standards work today in some specific instances? I know you would say they work better than some areas and not so well in other areas, but do we have a sense that we're about right? Or do we know of instances in which we are drastically wrong? We have large areas of parking space that are underutilized, or we have certain classes of developments that simply don't have enough parking. So where are we in that? What's our sense of how the current standards are working?
And I'll let Mike further respond, but I'll use single family attached homes. It's a rate that is the same base rate that it currently is, but addresses a need that we have heard through the community of shared parking. It's something that the issues in those townhouse communities is lack of visitor and shared parking in those communities. As such, we have proposed a portion of that rate to be for shared or visitor parking, which previously wasn't, which while looking at it may be the same rate, but actually increases that rate. I know Mike did multiple studies personally regarding certain different uses. I don't know if he wants to give any examples of those, but I'll let him take it away.
Yeah, I did look at some common uses, and we also got some data about common uses. Excuse me. For example, retail, the current requirement for the number of spaces, let's say at a CVS, the average square footage of a CVS requires about 80 spaces. Numerous surveys of CVSs and Walgreens and other similar standalone uses in the county show less than half of that parking being used at times of peak demand. So that was a situation that we could see we needed to look at with regard to the appropriate parking rate.
Michael, who did the surveys?
I did the surveys.
You did the surveys?
Yes. Fast food restaurants, another use that has a very high parking requirement in the current ordinance. And most of the fast food, or except for Chick-fil-A, most of the fast food establishments in the county are well overparked, and parking demand for these uses is probably a third to a half of the parking supplied. So we have that information. We've also gotten information on multifamily development in places like Tyson's, the higher density areas, where even with a lower parking supply that was built for those developments, there's still empty spaces within the parking lots of these buildings. So, that helps us look at, what is the appropriate approach for Tyson's. And I'll stress once again, I know Austin stressed it in his presentation, what we're talking about are minimum requirements. We're not talking about limiting developers except for Tyson's.
No, and I we don't need to waste our time on that. I think that's clearly understood.
Right.
My sense is not quite like yours. I just surveyed some local multifamily buildings and driven around their parking lots and at different times of day. And it seems to me that, well, during the business hours, they're not so well parked, but you go through in the evenings, they are pretty full. They're full. I would say they're, reasonably full. And in many cases, you see apartment buildings that have filled up the public street from one end of the block to the other because they're overflowing. And that's quite common. 7 Corners, in my estimation, the shopping center is the parking is seems to me quite adequate and not overdone. On the second level at the western end, sometimes it's a little sparse. But the main part, especially around the Home Depot and the post office and those ends, I think the parking seems about right. You can't use every parking place because then you'd be driving forever. So I'm just skeptical that we understand whether or not the new standards will provide adequate parking, or in some cases may provide too much parking. It just seems to me we don't have a clear understanding of what we're about in that respect. And so I wonder, as an example, what the staff is going to do when they analyze a proposal to reduce parking by 60% below the minimum. They will do an analysis. What's the analysis going to be based on? If they based it on what goes on at 7 Corners today, I think they would say, well, if it's like 7 Corners, that makes little sense. If perhaps they could find a parking a shopping center or a multifamily building or whatever to use as an example that would say, sure, 60% is fine. I just don't think while we debate a lot about the hypothetical benefits, I think the focus should be on whether or not the numbers are right. And in some cases, the numbers will not provide enough parking, almost certainly, because this isn't arithmetic. 2 and 2 is 4. We know that will be some cases where this reduction will cut into the parking that is needed in that development. And the question then is, and what should be addressed, in my view, in the staff report is, what do we do about that? What do we do about that? And 60 and 18 months is not the time frame to validate these standards, because these standards are, a building that's built today, it'll be 10 years, 20 years out. Whatever parking is provided, that's going to be the parking for that development. So there really needs to be some understanding of how the adjacent communities are protected in the event or when the parking that has been provided to the minimum parking space has been provided and it's not enough. Just as an example, my grandson lives on the Lower East Side in New York. He has a car. He parks it in Brooklyn because he's going to have a car, but he can't park it in the Lower East Side of Manhattan because it's too expensive. So he gets on the subway every 2 weeks and he moves his car. Now that's an extreme example. I don't think there's going to be a lot of that, but people that have cars are going to park them. And I think it's hard to say that by providing less parking, people will have fewer cars. So there really needs to be a clear thought process and provisions made for what's to be done if it turns out there's not enough parking. That's my suggestion.
Thank you, Clyde. Well,
Excuse me, before you guys leave, you were mentioning adequate, or Clyde was bringing up adequate parking. What does Fairfax County consider adequate parking for the residents? Are we supposed to be searching for places? Is that what Fairfax County is looking at, or what is considered adequate parking?
Well, Donna, let me try. Look, you can't say whether or not people are going to have cars. If they want to have cars, they're going to have cars. There's no way to tell people they can't have a car. If the parking that's provided on site is not adequate, people are going to be cruising around the adjacent neighborhoods looking for parking. So the parking that's on site is inadequate because the people that live there want to have more cars than on-site parking is provided for, and it's going to happen. Now, if it's 1 or 2 cars, who cares? But
I think adequate is subjective. I think adequate is subjective. What is adequate to me may not be adequate to you, may not be adequate to someone else.
Adequate is just whether or not somebody owns a car and he's trying to park it. So I can't tell you, tell me there's going to be a multifamily building, how many cars they need. I don't know. The people that move in there will own cars or they won't.
Right, and I think that summarizes it. People make choices.
And they're going to have more cars than you're going to have allowed minimum parking for.
I believe your son or your son-in-law made a choice to own a car in a place that discourages car ownership because it's so difficult to find a place to park. And so he made a choice to park his car in Brooklyn to be able to have that available to him. So, you
want us to be New York City?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that choice is a part of this conversation.
But I guess what I'm saying is, even though it is subjective, what does Fairfax County see as what are you guys trying to implement that you see as adequate? What would
I think the proposal that we have is what we see as being adequate.
The minimum requirements, a minimum requirement for parking being the minimum amount of space is required for a use or a development or a shopping center is what we believe to be adequate.
And what if your estimates are wrong, Austin? What then? What's the solution if you're wrong?
Mike, would you like to address that?
Well, people will have to find a place to park. And if there are other restrictions on parking in that neighborhood, such as a residential district or other on-street restrictions, then they'll have to continue to search for a place to park.
There you go.
No, it's also the developer who's
Lowering
building
quality of life.
I think the office builder knows their market, the retail builder knows the market, the residential builder knows the market. And you're gonna know when you're gonna move in there, what you have for cars. You're making those decisions. So is someone gonna say,
Bill,
I know my
COVID.
retail requires this number of parking spaces, but Fairfax, I need less, so I'm gonna build less. You're gonna make a decision as an office.
COVID, we don't have a clue where we're going. Neither do you. If you did, you'd be not sitting there. You'd be on a yacht somewhere. Nobody knows what the hell we're going to be facing. And we do know climate crisis is at our feet. That I don't think anybody here denies.
And providing more parking spaces certainly doesn't help that, Tammy. I think you know that
I'm
too.
not saying that. I'm saying you deduct parking, you lower what is necessary to get your permit and actually do your development. Put that, where are you putting, why don't you put that in trees? So you have an out, so you're helping the environment. There's nothing there that suggests that. We passed ZMOD, where people who have lost jobs from COVID can start home-based businesses. Whoa, now we're reducing necessary parking. There goes those. This thing hasn't been, this is complicated. You guys have simplified it. That's Disney. We don't live in Disney. We live in the real world. And people have guns and ammo. And there's going to be more rage trying to find a parking spot. Have you thought about that? It's crazy.
Yes, and we had a meeting and someone suggested that we should build parking for communities based upon Super Bowl Sunday and Thanksgiving, 10, 12 spaces per unit. That's ridiculous too. So where's the right number?
That is.
You know,
that is. And we're just asking
we're saying,
all
you know,
this until it's thought
the retail rate that was established in 1978 is probably not correct.
So if people, one final point, if people choose to have cars and there's not adequate parking, we said adequate is subjective. I assume they would have to park in private garages or metered parking or something to that effect.
Potentially, yes.
Well, is VDOT going to put meters on their streets? I doubt they want the maintenance of striping, collecting, and dealing with vandalized meters. Have you worked those details out?
Well, the county is actually working on a project to establish metered parking in Tysons and Reston. So that is also part of this mix. It's not directly related to what we're doing, but on-street parking regulation and potential fees for on-street parking are.
And who gets those fees? VDOT? It's their property.
It would be.
They're really picky, I'll tell you. They don't even want trees overhanging their roads because they hate leaves.
Well, I think that I'll let that be the last word for tonight. And I appreciate everyone's comments and discussion. It was a good discussion. And so we also, just to let everyone know, we have another public open house next Thursday night at the same time. So we can continue the dialogue and perhaps have some new conversations next week. So thank you very much for your participation tonight.
And I'd also like to say that, as I mentioned earlier, Bill had earlier put our webpage in the chat. I would suggest that anyone interested in this project visit our webpage, where there is a option there through public input to give us your input on this project so that we can, anyone interested can comment on it. And so if you're interested in this, please comment on the project via that public input page so that we can have those written documents of people's opinions on the project and their comments and suggestions. But again, I'll echo Mike, say thank you so much for your time tonight. And we look forward to interacting during future public engagement.
Thank you very much, and we'll all be back.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a
Have
good
a good
evening.
night.
Good night.